First, I want to thank you very much for being here. Before we get started with the actual interview, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit to our audience?
My name is JC Crumpton. I am a multi-genre writer. I have published a novel that is basically paranormal historical fiction about the Crescent Hotel in Eureka Springs. I have also published a collection, Cardboard Heroes, which deals with many different genres in both poetry and short fiction as well. I've also been included in several science fiction and fantasy anthologies. I've graduated from the University of Arkansas with an English degree with a creative writing emphasis, and I have been living in Bentonville at this house for 16 years with my wife and kids. The kids have actually moved out now, so
All right, so first question: what book from childhood shaped you most as a writer?
well, I love fantasy, and of course, Lord of the Rings was my go-to during my junior high and high school years. I read it once or twice every year. But the book that really got me into an interest in writing was Andre Norton's book, Here Abide Monsters. And for some reason, that one just, it really, I loved the story. It was an adventure. It was science fiction. It was everything that I wanted to escape. That's why I read. I wanted to have these adventures, this fun, and I wanted to give that to other people. And so I started actively pursuing a desire to write, basically about ninth or 10th grade in high school.
So, when you're writing, do you find that writing energizes you, or do you find that it exhausts you?
Both. When I really get into a story, I don't stop. I keep going, but then there are times when, like for instance, the editing process, and I'm editing basically I turned in a 550-page manuscript, and I'm editing that right now, and that can be kind of laborious, and that can be kind of sapping of the energy.
That's
But
fair.
the actual creating, the writing, the adventure of the story, that is exhilarating. I can sit down and say, okay, I'm going to write for 15 minutes, and I look up 2 hours later and I'm still writing.
That's awesome. So you find that the drafting is easier, and it's the editing and revision that's harder.
Right.
Okay, interesting. Because it's the I interviewed Carlos Hernandez, and he had the opposite. He said that he's a very slow writer, but that he loves the editing and the revision because he feels like that's when he
Oh,
gets to
okay.
actually shape it. So it's really cool how there's multiple approaches to the same
Yeah.
project. How many books did you write before you were published?
Two,
Two.
and they are on the shelf over there.
Wow. So the book that you said that Silence in the Garden was your debut, right?
Yes.
Did that book get you an agent? Do you have an agent with that, or
No, I do not. I do not have an agent. I have two different publishers. One is Ogma, who Silence in the Garden and Cardboard Heroes is through, and then I also with Pro Se Press. They do a lot of the new pulp fiction, a lot like your Buck Rogers, or your adventures, sort of things you read when you were a teenager, and the things that you would like to go back to as an old person that you want to go back to and live that kind of life as a teenager, the adventure stories.
cool?
So I've got those two, and I met both publishers at conventions.
Interesting. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Well, for Pro Se, I was going to a lot of the different conferences around the area, Kansas City, Little Rock, Dallas, Memphis, and I just kept taking notes. I just kept going to every breakout that I could that had the people that I wanted to meet, and then I just started kind of creeping into the little groups and listening on the outside, and then kind of interjecting a little bit every now and then. And then one day, Tommy just said, hey, let's go to lunch, and it was just he and I. And he said, well, what do you have? And so I told him about a story, and he's like, okay, well, I'm putting together an anthology, and I'd like your story, and gave it to him. And with the other one, I wasn't actually at a conference. It was with Ogma Creative Media. I was actually at a contract signing for a friend of mine who was just signing on with Ogma, and the publisher came up to me and he said, well, hey, I hear you write, and you're writing a story about the Crescent Hotel. And I was like, well, yes, I am, but I'm here for my friend. But then I realized, well, if I don't grab this opportunity, it might pass me by. And so I grabbed the opportunity. I talked to him, and he asked me to send him my manuscript, what I had so far. I sent it to him, and he said that the acquisition board gave unanimous approval. So I was signed on to Ogma, and I have two different series contracted with them.
That's really cool. So is having an agent something that you're interested in pursuing, or are you happy with working directly with a publisher like you do now?
I've never had an agent, so I can't really say which is better. I do enjoy the personal communication with the publisher. I don't have to go through the intern, through the secretary, through the gatekeeper. I don't have to go through all that. I send an email to the person that I need to talk to, and they respond to me. They give me a call, something like that. But I guess to reach a global audience, you're going to need to eventually hook up with one of the big five, and their gatekeepers, they go through agents. I don't think very many of them, they have unagented windows, but the likelihood to get in through one of those is very small. So I would eventually like to get an agent, but right now I'm just enjoying the art of writing.
How how did you deal with the actual contract signing without an agent? Because I know usually with at least with the big five, the agent will sort of go through and argue on specific clauses. Did you do any of that, or were you happy with the boilerplate, or?
I did a lot of research, and I also, for the last 25 years, I've been in the business community selling to the world's largest retailer. So I understand a little bit about contracts and business and numbers. And if things didn't match what I figured that they should match, I would cross them out, rewrite what I thought was best, and send it back. And it was a negotiation process.
So you mentioned that Silence of the Garden is a paranormal historical suspense novel. It's set in Eureka Springs, and it takes place in one of, at least Arkansas's most famous haunted hotels, the Crescent Hotel. What made you want
Yes.
to set your novel there?
When I was in high school, well, my father was military, so I moved around a lot. But he retired when I was in high school, and we went to Huntsville, Arkansas, which is just south of Eureka Springs. And my group of friends, we all wanted to be writers, musicians, artists, and so we would go up to Eureka Springs a lot and just kind of soak in the vibes. It was an artistic, eccentric community. We wanted to be part of it. And then one of my friends, his mother started managing the Crescent Hotel.
Wow.
And we had heard about these ghost stories and stuff. So we just went through the whole place trying to find ghosts. Unfortunately, I can say that we never found one, but I have talked to a lot of people who have had experiences, including my sister-in-law, and she and my wife's brother went to the Crescent Hotel for their anniversary and stayed in one of the most haunted one of the most haunted rooms, and they experienced the bathroom door kept opening.
Interesting.
I used to talk to a bartender. Doc Baker's Lounge was up on the top floor. It's now a pizza place, but it used to be called Doc Baker's Lounge. And I talked to the bartender up there, and she had all kinds of stories about different events that took place. And I tried to actually put her, not her herself, but kind of her character into the book, the bartender there, because the setup of the book is actually, it takes place in two different times. It takes place back in the 1920s when it was the Crescent College and Conservatory for Young Women, and deals with some of the events that may or may not have made the ghosts. And then it also bookends in the modern time, and that is when I had the character that was the bartender.
Interesting. That's really cool. So did you do a lot of research into the 20s?
Believe it or not, I first started writing it. I just wrote it out, and then I was like, okay, well, I'm going to go do the research and make sure nothing is so terribly wrong. And the really weird part is that I found out that so much of it was right. It was like somebody had been sitting over my shoulder saying, nope, that's right, that's wrong, that's right, And so it was like my research just basically confirmed a lot of the stuff that I had already written down.
That's
It
so
was just
cool.
amazing.
So it wasn't a terrible revision, at least research wise. That's
No, it was. I mean, I knew it. Like I said, one of the friends in my group, his mom managed the place, and so I knew the backstory. I knew the place. I knew the feeling, the vibes of everything that took place in there. I knew the corridors, the back stairways. I mean, all that different stuff I'd already felt, and so I just had to put it on paper.
that's so cool. We went on the ghost tour, and we unfortunately didn't see anything either. I wanted to. I was like that BuzzFeed Unsolved guy, like, hey, they're demons, it's me, your boy. I really wanted to see something. I wanted so badly to just go run around in that place and explore it, just because it's such a big old cool building. Boy, the Crescent has some crazy history, so I can totally see why you.
Oh yes, yeah. May
So,
have to write another one about Doc Baker.
oh yeah, I was just
The
thinking that there was like That wasn't even touching on the doctor stuff.
A couple years ago, they found in an archaeological dig, actually at the Crescent, found a bunch of stuff that had been left over from that era. Bottles filled with samples and specimens and stuff.
That's so cool.
Yeah. Now you remember the old ghost hunters from the Sci-Fi Channel?
Hmm.
They actually went there, and it was one of the few episodes where they saw something that they couldn't explain.
Huh.
And so I knew about that episode, and so I put in a ghost hunting program into that bookend of the time. So there's a person there who's trying to do a show about the ghosts.
So, are there any other haunted locations in Arkansas or elsewhere in the world that you're interested in exploring in your work?
There's a town in Kansas that has a haunted hotel. I've stopped by there once. I cannot remember the name of the town. I know it's on Highway 400, and it's a town where on the first or third Saturday of every month, planes fly into a small grass airstrip, and they're allowed to taxi down the roads in town, and they all basically taxi up to this hotel, which has a bar. So that kind of concerns me too. These pilots are coming up and they're going to be drinking, so hopefully they just themselves, and something happens, it's away from everybody. But they also have a ghost legend that I would like to explore sometime, possibly. It's a kind of like a spurned lover sort of mystery.
So, according to your bio, you've lived all over. You mentioned San Diego, California, Iceland, Germany. You said that you went to high school in Arkansas. Was that something that you moved to later? Did you start in Arkansas, move around, and come back? How did that work?
I was born in Anaheim, California, and for the first 5 years of my life, lived in San Diego. Then my father was transferred to Great Lakes, Illinois, which is basically North Chicago, Waukegan, to train recruits. And we lived up there. I love Chicago. I love the food. I love the museums, everything about Chicago. And then we moved from there to Iceland. That's where I learned to play soccer. I'm very passionate about soccer now, but they called it football, of course. And then from there, I went to Germany for 6 months with my maternal grandparents, back to Iceland for a few months before going to Virginia while my dad retired. And then I was in the 8th grade, and we moved to Huntsville, Arkansas.
So, was there anything that ever tempted you to set any of your works in those other places?
Well, actually, I am working currently. The book I'm writing now, not the one I'm editing, but the next one that I'm writing is a historical horror, and it's about Vikings, and part of it takes place in Iceland. So, but it's a historical horror about the Vikings, their settlements in Greenland. I was doing some research. According to the historical record, there's two Viking settlements in Greenland. According to the archaeological record, there's three. So I started going, what happened to that third? Why did it disappear out of history? And so putting all that together, I have come up with a reason, and that will be in the book.
That's awesome. You said that's the one that you're actually drafting right now?
Yes, it's the one I'm working on right now.
Cool. That sounds awesome. So your other works, do you have any other works that you've set in Arkansas, or is it, I know the Crescent is very specific to Arkansas. Have you set other things in the area?
I have, one of the two books that I wrote that I haven't published, one of them was set in Arkansas. You remember the things that happened with Mina?
Yep.
It was kind of like that, except it was more supernatural horror elements involved. I haven't finished that one. Well, I mean, it's finished, but it's not ready. Maybe I can rewrite it. I don't know. But it's also set in Arkansas.
So, your second book that came out, so that's not just short fiction, it's also poetry, and that's interesting to me because I've seen a lot of short fiction collections, but I haven't seen as many poetry or short fiction and poetry works combined together. How is poetry for you different creatively from writing short fiction?
I use poetry I tell people, I explain poetry is to exercise my demons. And I think most creative people do have a tendency to gravitate towards depression. And I use that outlet of poetry to deal with depressive thoughts that I have. So none of my poetry is roses are red, violets are blue. They start off with things like, I felt the knife in my ribs, or, stuff like that, the darkness. So I exercise the darkness with my poetry.
Are there any tools that you use for writing poetry that you've found that you also end up deploying in your fiction work as well?
No, I think other than observation. Well, I wrote a poem last month And sitting here in my office, I have two windows across the way. There's an elderly couple that lives across the cul-de-sac from us, and they have two rocking chairs on the front porch. Looked out there one day, and only the husband was sitting there, and I'm like going, "Well, did something happen to the wife?" And so I wrote a poem about that, about something had happened to the wife, and then she came out a little bit later. But it's that's what I do with my poetry is I observe things that are taking place in the world right now. Observation would be I think the key thing that goes back and forth between both the fiction and the poetry, being able to observe and see and understand.
If someone were interested in starting to write poetry or pursuing being a poet, what's some advice that you would give them?
Find a voice that you like and something that speaks to you. I look at music as very as poetic. It's poetry. It's poetry to a tune. And that's the advice I would have for anybody else is to read a lot, but also to listen to the poetry of words. You can actually hear poetry in people talking. Some of Martin Luther King Jr.'s old speeches are just very poetic. Ronald Reagan's speeches are very poetic at times. You can find poetry in a lot of things, and that's what I would have people do to get into poetry. Just start listening, reading and listening.
Do you have any poets that come to mind that you would recommend reading?
It's AI. She actually was a professor at Oklahoma State University. She passed away recently, but she had poems that were her books were called things like Sin, Lust, Greed. And when I was in college, one of my professors who read my poems said, "You really ought to check her out." It was because she was dark. Then that's why she really wanted me to check her out. She would write things like from the point of view of Ted Bundy, from the point of view of Marilyn Monroe as she was overdosing. So to me, was a real focusing voice that I heard. I also like Billy Collins. He a few years ago, was the poet laureate of the U.S. Maybe about 10 years ago, I think. Those are the two ones that really stand out. Now, also, I do like some of the old poets, like Wordsworth. He got me in trouble in college. I got in an argument with the professor because I didn't agree with the professor's assumption that Slumber Did My Spirit Seal was about death. I figured it was about the transition from youth to adulthood of a boy who was close to his mother, and he realizes as he gets older that his mother is going to die. So there's death involved in it, but I don't think it's strictly about death. And I ended up getting a B+ on the paper.
That's awesome.
So I was able to support my conjecture with data.
So I know you said that you've got a book that you're editing and a book that you're drafting. Do you have a release date or anything for that book that you're editing, or is that something that you're going to start submitting soon?
Well, the one I'm editing, well, I mean, it's already been accepted. I got it back from the publisher, and those are the edits that they want me to do
Okay,
to
cool.
finish it. And they actually had thought about breaking out part of it as a novella, and I was like, well, no, because it deals with 4 different timelines, and they were talking about breaking out one of the timelines as a separate novella, and I was like, no, I don't want to do that because there are things that you would learn in that novella that would kind of ruin the surprises in the other 3 timelines. So and the way the structure goes is it starts in one timeline, goes to the next, goes to the next, goes to the next, and then back and forth, and all these elements are related to each other. And that's a science fiction mystery. And there's a murder in a space station that orbits Venus as they are trying to make Venus more Earth-like. They're trying to terraform the planet. And when I first thought about that, I was like, Venus is like the hottest planet in the solar system. Everything gets crushed if it goes down because of the pressure. It rains acid. How are we going to make this livable? And there's actually been a lot of research done on it. And I had an article from a paper that was about living on Venus in the atmosphere, in the upper atmosphere, floating in dirigibles. And then this documentary came up about a few weeks ago that I watched, and I'm like going, "Hey, I've read this article that this was based off of."
How much research did you have to do to write that?
Composition notebooks. I have 2 of them filled with notes and articles that I would reduce the articles down to composition notebook page size and then glue them in there, and so it actually makes them thicker, and so they're both about this thick. It's I'm about that thick, both of them, And that's how much notes I have on it. And it was just, and that's why there's going to be that long lull between my releases. From 2018 was my last release, and that's because I've been working on this one for so long. And it's big. It's going to be over 500 pages.
How long did you research before you wrote, or did you sort of write and research as you went?
Yes, I wrote and researched as I went, but it was the research for that. I actually started that book before I got a publisher. It was actually one of the manuscripts that I sent in to Ogma that they used to determine that they wanted to buy it, and so it became one of the series. It's the first book in the series.
Cool.
Now the other planned 4 books are not planned to be as thick, but this one that introduces it's called the Lawnford Universe, and it's the one that's the whole series is the Lawnford Universe, and this is the book that introduces it and sets the setting.
So
Yeah.
how come you moved from like a historical supernatural thriller to science fiction and then back to historical horror?
I read multiple genre. I don't stick in one genre when I'm reading, so I don't do that when I'm writing either. I write whatever comes to mind, whatever I'm enjoying at the time. There's a story that's in Cardboard Heroes called Jack and Jill, and someone wrote a review about it, and they said basically it was a romantic thriller. I'm like, oh, I never thought about that, but I guess it really is. So I wrote a romantic thriller, kind of a darker romantic thriller, but there is that element of romance in there. I mean, that's one of the driving forces in the story that drives it forward is a quest for romance. So, and I've published a Western novella back in 2016 called A Field of Strong Men, and it's also included in Cardboard Heroes. So I've written fantasy, I've written science fiction, I've written horror. I read everything, so I want to write everything. I don't want to be pigeonholed, and I know that there were some writers, I mean, even Stephen King with his Richard Bachman novels, would kind of separate his science fiction-esque stories from his horror stories. I don't want to do that. I want to put everything all together. I want to put, there is no JC Crumpton A and JC Crumpton B. I just want it to be all JC Crumpton, and so I have all these different genres that I read. I want to write them all as well.
That makes total sense. I saw on your blog that you were talking about how you miss movie theaters, and I am 100% there with you. What's the last movie that you saw in theaters?
Tenet.
Tenet.
Yeah, it just came out recently, a few weeks ago. I went and saw it because I miss theaters, but right now everybody is so scared that the theaters have reopened, but they're empty. I mean, Tenet it's a Christopher Nolan directed movie. It's an awesome movie. It's great. It's exciting. The soundtrack is, you want to talk about something that causes anxiety, that soundtrack causes anxiety, and just goes just perfectly with the plot of the movie. But my wife and I were in there with maybe 6 other people, and we were in one of the big theaters. And so I really hope that this pandemic doesn't change society that much that we end up getting everything on streaming. I want to go to the theater. I want the sound so loud that it's shaking my seat, that I want the smell of popcorn. I want the 50-foot by 30-foot screen. I want that. I can't do that in my house. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff that's streaming out there right now. I just finished Utopia on Amazon Prime, the first season of that, and that was amazing. But I'd rather go to the movie. So that's the thing. I would rather go to the movie than see a lot of this good stuff on streaming services.
Do you have plans to go back to the movie theater, or?
I was just looking today to see what was coming out.
Oh, cool.
What's going to happen is this is going to go viral, and everybody's going to start going back to the theater.
Yeah. Well, we'll keep this on the quiet so that you can keep going to the movie theater, because I miss the movie theater so much. What current genre trends excite you? I know you said you're a huge reader. Is there any stuff coming out that's got you really stoked?
Over the last few years, I've been reading a series by James S.A. Corey, which is actually the pen name of two writers, Ty Frank and Daniel Abraham, and called The Expanse. And it was the TV rights were bought by Sci-Fi Channel, and they did 2 seasons, and then they did 3 seasons, then Amazon did the 4th season. 5th season's getting ready to come out in December. But the books themselves are just amazing. I like it because it deals with science fiction, but it's very political. So it's an intrigue novel, each of them, and there's 8 of them. There's going to be 9 in the whole series. The ninth one is coming out at the beginning of next year, and that'll be the end of it. And I guess it's because all those characters are actually getting old now, and they've done a lot. And it's just it's exciting adventure, political drama. It's a grown-up Buck Rogers. It's Buck Rogers for grown-ups. You have that excitement, that adventure, but you have the intellectual intrigue of business, politics, civilian versus military versus, you're dealing with 3 different cultures, with Earth-based people, Mars-based people, and people who have lived in the belt and just floating around in space forever. So you have all those, and those are going to create many different cultures. I mean, if you look at our own history, when the New World started being colonized, you had completely different cultures developing here in the Western Hemisphere than what they came from in Europe. It deals with a lot of that, and I've really been intrigued with that.
I have heard really good things about it.
Yeah, I really enjoy them. And as far as fantasy, the grimdark is where a lot of things are right now in fantasy, and I'm not as up on grimdark as a lot of other people. I'm more of the epic fantasy. I really enjoyed the first 4 books of A Song of Ice and Fire. I refuse to read the 5th one because he's not done with the 6th one yet. I'm reading the 13th book, Gathering Storm, in the Wheel of Time. I remember that book, the first book that came out, The Eye of the World, when I was in high school. I was a senior in high school when it came out, and I was just like floored. I love, like I said, when I was in junior high and high school, Lord of the Rings was my go-to. I love that sense of adventure. In fact, I just got back from a week in the mountains and wilderness, staying away from everybody, just getting out there, and I'm looking at the dark sky where I can actually see stars now. I've lived here in this house for 16 years, and you can't see half the stars outside that you used to 16 years ago, and that kind of scares me. I love to look up and explore. When I travel, a lot of times my wife learned quickly that I don't get lost. I just explore. We've never been down this road. Let's go see what's down here.
Let's say that they're making a movie out of Silence in the Garden. Who would you want cast in the lead?
As Mildred, it would have to be probably Alicia Vikander, and she also played in. She'd have to be Mildred because Mildred is tough.
And who would you want to direct it?
Scorsese.
Cool. And then my last question: what is something that's made you happy lately?
My granddaughter. And right now, I call her Rabbit. It's her nickname from me. She's a year old, just barely a year old, and she is a pappy's girl. If I'm around, she has to have me hold her. And sometimes she won't even go back to mama, even over grandma. She'll come to me. And so yeah, that is one thing that has made me really happy lately.
Oh, that's awesome, man. That's all the questions I have. Thank you again very much for sitting down and talking with me tonight, man.
And my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
All right, man. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate again you joining me.
No problem. Thank you.